Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. And we are going to now jump into the second half. So, this will be part 2 of Chapter 11, where we were discussing political crime and terrorism, and we were just about to get ready to jump into some contemporary forms of terrorism, as we have already covered political terrorism and some history of terrorism and some criminal aspects of political terrorism and even things like state political crime, etc. So now let's go ahead and again, this is part 2 of the Chapter 11 lecture. So today the term terrorism encompasses many different behaviors and goals, and some of the more common forms are some of the things we're going to talk about. So political terrorism, we know political terrorism is directed at people or groups who oppose the terrorist political ideology, and that means how they think or what they believe, or whom the terrorists define as outsiders, people who don't belong or they don't think that should belong, and because of that, because they're an outsider, they have to be destroyed. Political terrorists may not want to replace the existing government, but really they may want to just shape it so that it accepts their particular views. So again, kind of an interesting concept. So now let's look at some of those groups that fall under the definition that we just kind of talked about. So we'll start with right-wing political groups. Domestic terrorists in the United States can be found across the political spectrum. On the right, they tend to be heavily armed groups organized around such themes as white supremacy, anti-abortion, militant tax resistance, and even religious revisionism. Identified groups have included, at one time or another, groups like the Aryan Republic Army, the Aryan Nation, the Posse Comitatus, and the Ku Klux Klan. These groups want to shape the U.S. government policy over a range of matters, including ending abortion rights, extending the right to bear arms, and eliminating federal taxation. According to federal officials, they are often organized into what we call paramilitary groups, that follow a military-style hierarchy or structure. They tend to stockpile illegal weapons and ammunition, trying to get their hands on fully automatic firearms or attempting to convert weapons into fully automatic weapons. They also try to buy or manufacture things like improvised explosive devices, IEDs, and they typically engage in wilderness survival or other paramilitary type training. So that's some of the groups that fall, let's say, under the right wing. And I have pictures that you can look at as well to add a little bit of extra context to what we're talking about. So that's the right. So what about the left? Well, during the turmoil of the 1960s, a number of left-wing political groups, such as the Weather Underground, emerged to challenge the existing power structure. Today, left-leaning domestic terror groups are committed to the protection of the environment. And of these groups, the ELF, or the Earth Liberation Front, is perhaps one of the better known groups. Founded in 1992 in Brighton, England by members of the Earth First group, environmental movement, the ELF has been active since 1994 throughout the world, including the United States. Operating in secret cells, and we know what cells are, they have conducted a series of actions intended on damaging individuals or corporations that they consider a threat to the environment. So that's one group. And then another group would be the Animal Liberation Front, the ALF. And they focus their efforts on protecting animals from being used as food, in clothing, or as experimental subjects. And their philosophy is that animals are entitled to the moral right to possess their own lives and control their own bodies, while rejecting the view that animals are merely capital goods or property intended for the benefit of humans and can be bought, sold, or killed by humans. So that's a couple of different groups, the ELF and the ALF. And there's a couple of pictures for you to look at as well. Revolutionary terrorism. So revolutionary terrorists use violence to frighten those in power and their supporters in order to replace the existing government with a regime that holds political or religious views that the terror group happens to find acceptable. Terrorist actions such as kidnapping, assassination, and bombings are designed to draw repressive responses from governments trying to defend themselves. And these responses help revolutionaries to expose, through the skilled use of media coverage, the government's inhumane nature. The original reason for the government's harsh response may be lost as the effect of the counter-terrorist activities is felt by uninvolved people. And some of these groups would include like the Jamaah Ismaila, which is an Indonesian terrorist group, or the Boko Haram, which is a Nigerian Islamic terrorist group. So there's a couple of examples, and I have some pictures as well. Another group that we'll talk about briefly would be nationalist terrorism. And nationalist terrorism promotes the interests of a minority ethnic or religious group that believes that it has been persecuted under majority rule. And in this area, terrorist acts are designed to force the government to basically give up land so that the minority group can have its own independent nation. While revolutionary terrorists are, again, aiming for the government change, the regime change in their home country, nationalists want to actually create a separate country of their own. So that's a little bit on nationalist terrorism. Some of the groups could be like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, directed terrorist attacks against Israel, the Hamas. Terrorist attacks have sent thousands of missiles into Israeli territory. The Hezbollah is a Lebanese Shiite Islamic organization founded in 1982 in response to the presence of Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. They are anti-West and anti-Israel and involved in things like kidnappings, car bombings, and even airline hijackings. And here's some photos of those particular groups. The next group would be retributive terrorism. So some terrorist groups are not nationalists, they're not political or revolutionary organizations. Their main goal is not to set up their own homeland or topple a government, though that may be part of their plan, but rather they want to punish people or governments that for ideological or political or religious reasons. So Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda, depending upon how you pronounce it, is the paradigm of the retributive terrorist organization. Rather than fighting for a homeland, its message is a call to take up cause. There is a war of civilizations in which the Jews and crusaders want to destroy Islam and must therefore be defeated. And, armed jihad is the individual obligation of every Muslim. Terrorism and violence are appropriate methods for defeating even the strongest powers, and the end product would be a unified Muslim world, the destruction of the West, and the end of Western influence. So, on the right, you can see the picture of the former leader of Al-Qaeda, which was Osama bin Laden. And again, retributive terrorists, rather than fighting for the homeland, their cause is more to destroy others that don't believe. And, kind of going back to jihad, even though the book talked about, jihad and destruction of the West, there are actually three meanings for this. So it means that true believers struggle to live as a Muslim. It's to build a Muslim society and to defend Islam with force necessary against non-believers. So it's three different meanings, and typically we hear it more as the destruction of the West. So, and here are some pictures of those that are involved in retributive terrorism. So another group, really quick, just to kind of add on, in Somalia, another retributive terror group, the Al-Shabaab, has been shifting goals and priorities, and they do not hesitate to attack real or imagined opponents, ones that they think that are against them, even in other nations. The most dangerous and well-known group is the so-called Islamic State, or IS, Islamic State of the Levant, or ISIL, or ISIL, or Islamic State of Iraq, and Al-Sham, or ISIS. So there are a couple of other organizations that you can look at it. Now, retributive terrorists also have a number of characteristics that are unique and separate, and separate them from, let's say, guerrillas or revolutionaries and other terrorists. And those are that violence is used as a method of influence, persuasion, or intimidation. Victims are usually selected for their maximum propaganda value, ensuring a high degree of media coverage. And also unconventional military tactics are used, secrecy and surprise. So another group that we'll look at briefly will be, again, state-sponsored terrorism, and this occurs when regressive and repressive governments, they force their citizens into obedience, oppressing minorities, and basically stifles political dissent. And sometimes death squads and the use of government troops are used to destroy political opposition parties that are often associated with political terrorism. Some of the more current, if you will, or contemporary forms of terrorists or terrorism would include what we call homegrown terrorists or violent extremists. Another word would be lone actor. So a lone actor or lone wolf terrorist, as they call it, they use violence or the threat of violence to achieve some political or social goal. And however, they don't receive orders, direction, support, or aid from any outside group. So through evaluation of this particular lone wolf phenomenon by Mark Hammond and Ramon Spa, they found evidence that most lone wolf terrorists are unemployed, single white males with a criminal record. Compared to members of terrorist groups, lone wolves are older, less educated, and more prone to mental illness. They are more likely to be, kind of removed from society and deprived of what they perceive as the status and benefits to which they are entitled, and this encourages them to basically form grievances against the government that they will hold responsible for their unemployment or discrimination or injuries, etc. And some recent examples of these homegrown terrorists would include someone like Nadal Malik Hassan, the Virginia-born Army major who yelled Allahu Akbar and proceeded to shoot and kill 13 and injure 31 at Fort Hood, Texas in 2009. Another one would be Faisal Shahzad, the one accused of the failed Times Square bombing, and there's a picture of him on the right and the vehicle that he used with all of the explosive compounds on the left. And here's a closer look if you're wondering what type of car that he actually used. Again, the lone wolf actor uses violence or threat of violence to achieve their political goal. They don't receive any assistance or direction support from the outside. Typically socially isolated loners with few friends. A lone wolf person would be, a great example would be the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. The Centennial Olympic Park bombing in 1996 by Eric Rudolph. So these are a couple examples of lone wolf terrorists or lone wolf actors or lone actors. And even LAPD former officer Christopher Dorner, who went on the rampage in Southern California that resulted in the death of several individuals, including police officers. So now we're going to kind of take a look at not just what motivates the terrorist, but also, again, the difference between, let's say, domestic and international. So it is important that we know this. So the FBI defines domestic terrorism as activities that involve acts dangerous to human life, that are a violation of criminal law of the United States or of any state, appear to be intended, and you'll start to see some things bleed over, to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. So basically, domestic terrorism is based and operated entirely within the U.S. with no outside or foreign direction, committed against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government or a civilian population or any segment thereof. You could see that in the Boston bombing would be a domestic terrorism thing. The federal building, the Oklahoma City bombing would be a domestic terrorism deal. And so that's domestic, but what about international? Well, international terrorism is a foreign-based or directed type terrorism by countries or groups outside of the U.S., but against the U.S. So, again, we're going to look at a couple of other different terrorists as we go through here, but I put together this chart that you can look at that talks about each one. So it talks about revolutionary and political, and we'll learn a new term called eco-terrorists in a minute, and national terrorists and retributive and state-sponsored and lone wolf. So each one of these has a little definition for you. So here's some other forms of terrorism that are important that you know. Cyber terrorism. This is terrorism that initiates or threatens to initiate the exploitation of or attack on computerized systems. There's agro-terrorism, which is the attack on agricultural systems. Bioterrorism, which is terrorism that involves biological weapons of mass destruction, things like anthrax or botulism or smallpox. There is narco-terrorism, which refers to the use of terrorist activities or attacks to support drug operations, to finance terrorism. And there's eco-terrorism, which are acts of violence committed to support the ecological or environmental causes. So there's all these different other forms of terrorism. and we'll go past this. All right, so what motivates terrorists now that we've kind of got a handle on some definitions? Well, in the aftermath of September 11th, destruction of the World Trade Center in New York City, many Americans asked themselves the same question. Like, why? What would motivate someone like Osama bin Laden to order the deaths of thousands of innocent people? And how could someone who had never been to the United States or suffered personally at the hands of the U.S. develop such hatred? Now, some experts believe the attacks had a political basis, claiming that bin Laden's anger was fueled by American Middle East politics, and others saw a religious motivation and claimed that bin Laden was a radical Muslim at war with the liberal religions of the West. Another view was that bin Laden's rage was fueled by deep-rooted psychological problems. As such, there have been a number of competing visions of why terrorists engage in criminal activities like bombings and shootings and kidnappings to achieve their political end. And some of these views we're going to go over right now. So the first one is the psychological view. And one of the most controversial views of terrorists is that some, if not all, suffer from psychological deficits, and that the typical terrorist can be described as a emotionally disturbed person who acts out of his or her psychosis within the confines of different violent groups. So that's the kind of a little summary of the psychological view. Another one would be the alienation view. So another explanation for terrorist activity is that lack of opportunity creates a sense of alienation that motivates men and women to embrace terrorism. A really good, interesting video is this video right here called The Terrorist Son. I would suggest you watch it. It's a story about how the son of an actual terrorist dealt with his dad being a terrorist. So kind of an interesting thing. So another view when you talk about what motivates terrorism would be the family conflict view. And here terrorists report that they are products of dysfunctional families in which the father was absent, or even if present, was a distant figure, if you will, and they were swayed to join the group or cult who serves as that father figure. Another view would be the political view. When people are left out of the political process, having their votes restricted, or even losing the right to vote, they may be inclined to join terrorist groups. There's another view, the socialization, or what we call the friendship view. Many jihadist recruits were living in foreign countries when they got themselves involved with these terrorist organizations. There's an ideological view where extreme ideological beliefs prompt an individual's behavior. So, I mean, all of these are kind of different views that we're looking at. There's a couple of videos that actually the individuals do interviews of suicide bombers, and they'll tell you what some of their motivations are. So kind of an interesting video to watch. So with that being said, we're going to talk just briefly about some methods that terrorists might use. So we know about these weapons of mass destruction. They include things like biological, chemical, or nuclear agents, sometimes explosives and bombs, sometimes armed attacks, sometimes arson, and even attacks on technology. And of the previously listed methods, a lot of the experts contend that the incendiary devices and explosives are the most likely to be used in a terror attack because they are first inexpensive, They are easy to make, and they are highly lethal, as evidenced by the devastation caused by an IED, or what's also known as an improvised explosive device. Suicide bombers, this is another method. Potential suicide terrorism may come from different backgrounds and different age groups, and may be male or female. Most suicide terrorists believe that the act makes them a martyr and ensures them a place in heaven. Again, methods, explosives, when we talk about explosives and bombs, whether it's sending suspicious packages or vehicle bombs or even suicide bomb. If you've never seen a letter bomb, here's a photo of one. And basically it's two connectors, and when the letter is open, the connections separate, which actually activates the bomb. You look in the back here, you can see a large container with gas that's inside of that, and a lot of fragmentation. So you have nails and screws and things. This was out of the back seat of a vehicle. There are the suicide vest type bombs and explosives. This is an actual drawing of what a suicide vest looks like. But here's a couple of actual pictures of one, so you can see what I'm talking about. These are the suicide switches. It can be a simple push button or a toggle switch. This is one that is a belt that's made out of paper, and here's the switch, and inside of the paper with the explosive are like nuts and bolts, other pieces of metal, and nails, and that's the frag or the fragments that blow out that cause the injuries. Here's a couple other examples of belts that have been recovered, and you can see how they're easily hidden under clothing. And this would be the explosives. Here's what another belt looks like. So just so you get an idea, here's a larger belt, and it can be hidden. It can be worn over the top, or something like this can be worn actually under a jacket. It looks a little bit bulky, but still it's kind of hard to tell that it's there. This is a belt that was made for demonstration purposes, and you can see that here's the frag. You have the pipe bombs in here. Here's the switches to activate the vest. And again, this was made by some law enforcement officers that I know, and they made it just to kind of show as what a suicide belt could look like, and all the nuts at the bottom, and again the nails for the frag. If you want to know what the effects are, here's a picture that should bring it all home, and then we'll finish up. When you talk about the effects of some of the shrapnel from suicide bombings, these of course are the nuts that are typically attached to screws, but they end up going through somebody's body, and if you're close enough, you can see the amount of damage that can be inflicted on something like that. This was a suicide bomb that was detonated inside of a bus, and you can see the damage that caused to the bus. When you look at, again, methods, when you talk again about things like weapons of mass destruction, these are things that are, again, biological, chemical, nuclear agents. They can be even radiation agents. If you look on the right, it's kind of, here's a chart that'll help you out. These are the types of mechanics or method that they're going to use based on the most likely to the more less likely. So explosives, the most likely, and nuclear, the less likely. Now, what would have the most impact would be like biological and nuclear, but they're very hard to come by. So greatest impact to least impact, most likely used to least likely used. So that should kind of give you a little idea. Again, chemical agents, you talk about weapons of mass destruction. There are 4 common types of chemical agents. There are nerve agents, there's blood agents, what we call choking agents, and blistering agents. And these are typically used in some terrorist incidents. The biological agents can be dissemination of things like anthrax or botulism or smallpox. They can be dropped into water sources or actually put into explosives. Nuclear terrorism is something that we should think about, because with more than 16,000 nuclear weapons worldwide, and given the fact that Islamic State groups are already possessing some low-grade nuclear material, you have to consider the fact, or the realm of possibility, that some of this stuff could fall into the hands of terrorists and be used as a nuclear weapon. When you talk about the media, terrorism really is futile without publicity. The media generates a lot of publicity. We call it the contagion effect. And this is where coverage of terrorism inspires more terrorism. It makes it contagious. And part of the terrorist thing is to inflict fear. And they inflict that fear by using our own media that generates all the publicity surrounding these different types of events. The extent of terrorism, when you talk about the threat, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism tells us that between 2002 and 2015, IS carried out more than 41,000 attacks, which caused a little over 33,000 deaths. Asia and Africa are locations of the most attacks, so not the U.S., and some of the most active groups include groups like the Taliban, the Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, IS, or Al-Shabaab. And all of those you have seen some photos of. When you talk about responses to terrorism, you have the Director of National Intelligence. Talk about combating terrorism with law enforcement. You have federal law enforcement. You have the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, which on October 8, 2001, President George W. Bush signed Executive Order 13228 that established the Department of Homeland Security. And then, of course, you have state, county, and local law enforcement as well. And then finally, combating terrorism, we wouldn't be complete with this discussion if we didn't talk a little bit about the U.S. Patriot Act. And the U.S. Patriot Act, soon after September 11th, those attacks, the U.S. government enacted several laws focused on preventing further acts of violence against the United States and creating greater flexibility in the fight to control terrorists and their activity. And most importantly, again, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act on October 6, 2001. And the Patriot Act basically expanded all four traditional tools of surveillance, things like wiretaps and search warrants and pin trap and trace orders, installing devices that record phone calls, and subpoenas. And the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, allowed domestic operations by intelligence agencies. The US APA gave greater power to the FBI to check and monitor phone, internet, and computer records without first needing to demonstrate that they were being used by a suspect or target of a court order. So a lot of this stuff was put into effect in order to combat terrorism, but there's been a lot of controversy that has been attached to it as it relates to, like, the Fourth Amendment and things like that. The search and seizure issues and stuff like that. So, along with the USA Patriot Act, it actually changed names at one point to the USA Freedom Act. So on October 26, 2001, President George W. Bush signed into law, okay, and the name is long, the United and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism, or the USA Patriot Act. And we know, we just talked about the fact it gives law enforcement the ability to search, detain, or eavesdrop in pursuit of terrorists. And when the USA Patriot Act actually expired in 2015, it was replaced by the USA Freedom Act. And the main change, really, in everything here was what they call Section 215. the section that most bothered civil libertarians, if you will. And under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the National Security Agency routinely collected metadata from some of the biggest cellular companies, not the contents of their conversation, but phone numbers, dates, times, and durations of calls. So if someone inside the U.S. called a number linked to one of 3 terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, an NSA alert system would note that fact. And the NSA could then ask the U.S. Foreign Intelligence Service court for permission to search the database for a list of all other numbers that the American phone had typically called, as well as numbers that were associated with that. So it's just a lot of, Fourth Amendment stuff like that. But you just need to know that the USA Patriot Act was replaced by the USA Freedom Act in 2015. And as part of this, there was a tweak to Section 215 that now prevents the National Security Agency from continuing its mass phone metadata collection. And if you want to know more about the Patriot Act, I have a little video clip for you there. Okay, so that kind of completes our lecture for Chapter 11. So remember, this was Part 2 of Chapter 11. So there's a Part 1 and a Part 2. Don't forget to take the time to look at the key terms at the end of the text chapter. Look at some of those questions at the end of the chapter that kind of get you starting to think a little bit on some of the content that we covered, the critical thinking questions, and then the key terms are also located in Canvas. So with that being said, again, that concludes our lecture on Chapter 11 totally, and this particular part being Part 2. So until next time.